Good morning and welcome to today's lecture on the course The History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, we'll be talking about the Old English period and primarily the Anglo-Saxon literature. And before we proceed, let me give you a very quick recap of the previous section. In the last lecture, we noted that the story of England and the story of English literature begins even before the English began to inhabit the island of England. As we can see over here, the initial tussle was between the Romans and the Celts, if you remember, were the original inhabitants of England. And now and later on, as many other invading tribes began to trouble the Celts, they asked for help from the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. But we also begin to see that they did not just help the Celts drive out the other invading tribes, but they just completely displaced the Celts and overtook the island of Britain. And since then, England is also known as the land of the Anglo-Saxons. And now, in case you're wondering whatever happened to the Celts who were driven out from England, they were the ones who the Celts they began to settle in these different places such as Cornwall, Wales, Ireland and Scotland. And we also know that the Celtic languages, which are in minority today, they are Cornish, Welsh, Irish and Scottish Gaelic as spoken in these respective provinces. And as we come back to the story of England, we find that the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, they began to have settlements in Ireland. And later on, we also find the Jutes get completely displaced and the land gets known in the name of Angles and Saxons alone. But this was not a very uneventful period. During this time, we find the Danes, the Vikings and all of them invading England at some point or the other. Because of that, we have the Dane law, which we saw in the previous section, and also some influence of the Norse language due to the continuous invasion of the Vikings. We also saw that the Vikings did not leave a very lasting influence because their policy was mostly that of hit and run. They did not want to have permanent settlements over there. And in between, another interesting thing happens. Christianity also finds fertile soil in the land of the Anglo-Saxons. By 597 AD, we find that the then King Ethelbert converts to Christianity and thereby leaving a long legacy of church and Christianity. And the Anglo-Saxon period comes to an end with the Norman conquest, which also we noted in the previous section. To continue situating the significance of Anglo-Saxon period and Old English literature, let's take a quick look at this historical timeline which is being given here. We find that there is a gradual transition from the Celtic period towards the Anglo-Saxons. There are, in terms of linguistic influences, we have the influence of Latin, then the influence of Old Norse and significant Norse element which is built into the language. And eventually we find that the transition moves on towards the later centuries, about which we will take a look at later on. We also note that the significant timeline of Old English period or Anglo-Saxon literature is barely a history of maybe 500 to 800 years. And also, if you take a look at this, the other more detailed map of literary periods, we find that this entire story of 500 to 1000 years or maybe 800 years is it takes only a short span in terms of timeline. When you scale it up to the entire literary periods, it occupies only a very little space in terms of literary output, in terms of literary and non-literary events as well. So let's begin this discussion on Old English period by taking a look at what has constituted this disproportionate timeline. Many historians have got different theories about this disproportionate telling of history, and some of the major reasons we would try to address over here. The first one being that there was very little written in the first 800 years, and even when there was things getting written, very little has survived into the posterity. And in terms of this accession is made in terms of quantity, quality and character of the literature which has survived, or of the literature of which there is some evidence of. And also there is this assumption that even when things were written down, maybe a lot of them were lost, because there is also this strong conviction that maybe it was mostly oral literature, oral tradition in place, so that maybe very little was written down, or perhaps there were lost copies. And however, whatever literature lacks strong evidence, the historians have not included as part of Old English literature. And the other important thing was that this was much before the age of proper documentation, before the age of print. So mostly the manuscripts were there in place, so it also made it all the more difficult to preserve them due to various conditions. And the most important reason that many historians identify of late is that of linguistic difficulties, because the old English tongue was not really English. It was mostly a Germanic tongue, and we would also note much later when we take a look at the language that Anglo-Saxon tongue or Old English Old English tongue was more like a distant Germanic foreign tongue. Because of that, there was hardly any semblance to modern English language, and for the same reason, even when the texts were unearthed from the Old English period, they had to be translated into the modern English in order for the language to make sense, or for it to be put under any kind of linguistic or literary scrutiny. So this perhaps has constituted to this disproportionate timeline. And moving on, which period falls under this Old English period or the Old Anglo-Saxon period? This period is from 499 to 1066 AD, and a little bit about the term Anglo-Saxon and Old English literature. In this course, we would notice that we'll be using these terms almost simultaneously, quite interchangeably too. But however, there are some historians who are of the opinion that the term Old English literature is more politically correct than that of the Anglo-Saxons, and also there are these historians who argue that the term Anglo-Saxons should be used in order to emphasize the cultural heritage that has been handed down to England and English literature. So in this Old English period, the literature was mostly oral in nature. And in terms of written prose and poetry, there's only a handful of texts which have survived, and there's no reason to assume that a lot more was actually written down, because the oral tradition seems to be the more dominant one during those times. And if we try to analyze the material that has been handed down to us, we can also note that the subject matter broadly falls into three major kinds. One is that of religion. This includes pagan religion and also Christian subject matter. And there's a discussion of war, because the Old English period, not just in England and also in most of the other European nations before the medieval period, it was mostly a story of war, conquests and territorial disputes, so on and so forth. And so that quite explains why the subject matter was predominantly about war and conquest. And also thirdly, it was also about the trials of daily life. So in that sense, the Old English literature, whatever is available to us, it becomes very important for us to understand the social life of the Old English period as well. Moving on, let's do a very quick survey of some of the texts which are continuing to be discussed in terms of Old English literature. The first one, and perhaps the most important one, is a text named Beowulf, and incidentally the text was never named as Beowulf, but the later historians, they have attributed this name to the text based on the name of the hero of the text. So this was also the only text to survive the ravages of time. In fact, this text is perhaps the only Old English text which is found in a single manuscript, but that's not to say that the manuscript was received without any damage. Partly it was also damaged in fire. So whatever translations that we have in the contemporary is based on all of these limitations put together. It was of anonymous origin. The authorship was not known at all, but there is an assumption that maybe it was a monk or someone else with an academic inclination who authored this piece, which is mostly in verse. And there's an obvious reason to assume this because church and monasteries were the center of education and the center of culture during those periods. So the clergy and the clerics were mostly the ones associated with education and literacy. So maybe it was authored by a monk, and also the subject matter is quite religious and allegorical in nature. And there's also this assumption that this heroic epic, as it has come to be known as, this was perhaps picked up by some Northumbrian poet at a later time, and he had fashioned it into a proper kind of an epic. So there are these various disputes about the authorship of this piece and who wrote it, or whether a group of people together contributed to it, so on and so forth. And in terms of the subject matter, this is about the mighty feats of a hero named Beowulf. And also this is important that it gives a glimpse into the past in terms of the life during those times, the belief systems that the people predominantly had, the kind of relationships that they had with one another, etc. And there's also this debate about whether the character Beowulf actually existed or not. One is not yet sure of it, but the kind of things that he talks about also gives an assumption that perhaps this was modeled on a great warrior who lived during those times. And also the author of the Beowulf, the author of this work Beowulf, has also come to be called as the Beowulf poet, one even leading one to assume that perhaps this was even written by someone named Beowulf, who also chose to give the hero the name of his own. When one analyzes the subject matter, there is also this some interesting details which are highlighted. It's written by a poet who was living among Christian people whose ancestors were known to have been pagan. So we find the Christian and the pagan elements being discussed in detail in Beowulf. And some historians are also of the opinion that the Christian element was later attributed to Beowulf, given the lineage of Christianity which has been left behind from the Anglo-Saxon and the later times onwards. And an interesting thing about the discussions and the literary critiques on Beowulf is that Beowulf was in fact, the discussions on Beowulf was in fact revived only in the 20th century, particularly in 1936, based on a lecture delivered by JRF Tolkien. The essay was called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. This is by far the most famous critical and historical work on Beowulf. And in this work, Tolkien argues that Beowulf should be seen more as a poem and less as a historical document, because seeing a work like Beowulf as a historical document alone takes away the literary attributes of the work. And what is this Beowulf about? And critics are of the opinion that this is perhaps the earliest text which allowed the audience to suspend their disbelief and listen to a narration. And this narration is basically about the tale of Beowulf, the dominant character and the protagonist, who's destined to become the king of Geats. Geats is a Swedish prominent tribe during those times. And Beowulf, the assumption is that he was a Scandinavian warrior. These details are unearthed from the analysis of the work from the later periods. And what forms the major topic is about the three major trials that Beowulf was forced to undergo during his lifetime. And these three major trials also incidentally demonstrates Beowulf's fearlessness and strength as a leader. These are the things which lead the historians into assuming that perhaps Beowulf himself was, the Beowulf poet himself was a leader who wanted to add on to some leadership qualities to his own life through these kinds of narrations. So these are three major trials. The storyline begins with this battle with a monster named Grendel, and later on it's followed by an attack by this monster Grendel's mother, and years later the hero Beowulf is again confronted by a dragon. So all of these different trials demonstrate the various ways in which his skills as a warrior and his skills as a leader gets displayed. And this work has also been extensively analyzed for its symbolism and allegory. But also some of the critics are also of the opinion that the figure of the monster or the figure of the dragon need not be analyzed in a more figurative or a metaphorical sense, because given the Old English period and their belief system, the pagan belief system on dragons, monsters and many supernatural beings, maybe they did not really allegorically represent anything. And also given the fact that this was written for a set of people who believed in their minds that all of these supernatural things existed, there was no need for any other allegorical kind of representation. And also it's an interesting feature to remember that Beowulf was made into a 2007 movie. And this also talks a lot about the contemporary interest in the story of Beowulf, and also how this could have been adapted into a very modern visual representation. And drawing your attention to the script, the old Germanic, the Old English script, which was mostly Germanic in nature, Here are the original manuscript letters, and this is a transliteration based on the modern letters. But whichever one we take a look at, we find that this is quite distant from modern English, and there is hardly any semblance to the way English is written, or the vocabulary or the sentence structure is fashioned in the contemporary. So these are also some of the difficulties in accessing the text Beowulf unless it is translated into modern English. And if we talk about Old English poetry in general, these two names of Caedmon and Cynewulf, they were mostly from the northern part. These two names dominate the discussion, and there's every reason to assume that their poetry was written soon after the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons into Christianity, because there are a lot of Christian elements built into the discussion, into the subject matter, into the treatment, so on and so forth. So mostly the themes were of biblical and religious nature, and however at the same time some of the allegories are quite contested, because one is not sure whether the Christian themes were attributed to them later on, or whether the authors themselves had a strong belief in the Christian system. And it's also considered that Caedmon, who dies in 680, and Cynewulf, who was born around 720, 730, his actual date of death is not yet known. It's also considered that both of them saw poetry as a divine gift, and these were things which were hitherto unknown to the Anglo-Saxon lifetime. These were things hitherto unknown to the Anglo-Saxon period. So this predominance of these two characters also gives us a lot of evidence into believing that maybe there were other works and other poets also who were living and writing during that time, but there is very little evidence to prove in terms of manuscripts or in terms of oral traditions that have survived into the posterity. And one of the works of Cynewulf is of utmost importance, where he talks about a wandering person and a lover of pleasure who is converted by a vision of the cross. In this sense, the dominance of Christian symbols and the dominance of Christianity interfering with the day-to-day life, about changing the lifestyles, changing the perspectives, changing the value system of a society and individual, all of these things become quite predominant in the analysis of some of the works. And THIER is another important poem of the manuscript of which has survived into the posterity. This is a poem of just 42 lines, and the subject matter is quite interesting. It's about the complaints of a minstrel who, after years of service to his lord, was replaced by a rival. So this also throws a lot of light into the daily lifestyle of Old English times. And we also get a glimpse into many famous legends of the old Germanic times, also leading us to believe that maybe there were a set of people who love to listen to folklore, to legends, and also to these great mighty feats of warriors, etc. And THIER as a poem is significantly important because it brings together a lot of elements which were uncommon during the Anglo-Saxon times. So in this we find a combination of the subject matter along with a very personal and elegiac theme, and this was not very common during those times to bring in a personal touch to the literature or to the verse form which was available then. The other significant writing was The Dream of the Rood, again a short poem, and this is a very predominant example of religious poetry that existed during those times, and particularly about The Dream of the Rood. Pat Rogers describes it as a vivid, complex, bold and brilliant piece. And this sort of complexity was not available to any of the other writings of those times. And here also it's important to note that it's of anonymous origin, the authorship was not known. And this work, The Dream of the Rood, primarily talks about the event of crucifixion in a very symbolic way. And the entire story is also narrated by a participant who witnesses the act of crucifixion. The rood symbolizes Christ's cross, and in this story we find that in this poem we find that a cross appears in a dream, and in the cross as a figurative symbolic element, it begins to address the dreamer himself. So in that sense the religious theme is very dominant throughout in most of the literature of the Anglo-Saxon period. How have we begun to access most of these works? So at this point it's important to draw your attention to what is now known as the Exeter book. This was kind of an anthology of Anglo-Saxon poetry which came into being around 970 AD, roughly about sometime during the 10th century. And the term Exeter is because this set of anthology was given to a person of anonymous origin to Exeter Cathedral by Bishop Leofric. So one does not know who had actually put this together and who had compiled this together, but historical evidences only talk about a certain Bishop Leofric handing over this anthology to Exeter Cathedral for preservation. And we do find that church here acts as a center which preserves cultural and literary artifacts for the future, because there was no other institution available of this stature and of this kind which could intervene with the daily life and cultural life of people there. And the Exeter book is also known to be the largest collection of Old English literature, and UNESCO has identified it as one of the world's principal cultural artifacts. We do find that the arrangement is not very systematic. All the works are quite haphazardly arranged, and also there is an assumption that maybe the Exeter book was originally copied from another collection that existed, but there is very little evidence again to prove that. And there are also a lot of disputes about whether the contents are largely secular or Christian, but there is evidence to prove that perhaps there is also a mix of both secular and Christian elements. So what were the contents of the Exeter book? It had a few major poems such as The Wanderer, The Seafarer, The Wife's Lament, The Husband's Message and The Ruin. And there are also 95 riddles, and some say almost 100 riddles, which are even now considered to be in possession of considerable literary skill. And there's also this thing known as the rhyming poem, which consisted a set of gnomic verses. Norm in Greek means moral aphorism or a proverb. So it was a set of proverbs or gnomes which were brought together in the form of alliterative verse. So these were the major contents of the Exeter book. And let's take a quick look at a couple of these poems which are considered to be quite noteworthy. And The Wanderer and The Seafarer, both these poems are considered almost as old as Beowulf. And they had significant religious allegory in place, and they were considered quite similar to one another. In terms of content also, they were quite similar. In terms of treatment also, there was a dominant religious element built into it. The Wanderer is in fact about the lament of a solitary man who was once a happy person leading a very joyful life. We find his life undergoing a transition after the Lord's death. The Lord means master during those times. And he laments about the passing away of the earlier time of happiness, friendship and companionship that he had with his master. The Seafarer is structurally it's like a monologue of an old sailor. He talks about the loneliness and hardships of a life at sea, but at the same time he continues to be in awe with the fascination that the adventurous life in sea offers. So this has been seen as quite allegorical and quite religious, comparing the daily struggles and the life adventures with that of the Christian life or the struggles during Christian life. And moving on, let's also take a look at what constituted Anglo-Saxon prose. The discussion on the presence of Anglo-Saxon prose begins only from the reign of King Alfred the Great, about whom we heard quite in detail in the previous section. King Alfred was a West Saxon king who ruled from 871 to 99. He was not just a warrior, but he was also a patron of art and literature. We find that he had supervised many translations during those times. He had instituted the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, about which we'll hear shortly. And there's also enough reason to assume that he was quite a learned person with a passion for art and literature. We also find him learning Latin at a later point of time in order to facilitate the translations from Latin to the vernacular. And he is considered to be the first one to put the vernacular to systematic use. And we find his contribution being the most significant in terms of prose. He not only encouraged these works to be written, but he also contributed to them himself. And he is credited to have been translated Venerable BD's Ecclesiastical History from Latin to vernacular tongue to Old English tongue. And in his own words, it's recorded that he wanted to translate from Latin into the language we all understand. But again, there are disputes about whether King Alfred himself translated the work, BD's work from Latin to English, or whether he just inspired and encouraged a group of people to undertake this mission. Having said that, what exactly is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle? This is perhaps the most important document of the Anglo-Saxon times that we have today. And as David Daitches describes this work, it's a series of annals which commence with an outline of English history from Julius Caesar's invasion to the middle of the 5th century and continues to 1154 AD. And the earliest records of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is from 60 BC onwards, even before the times of King Alfred, but King Alfred is said to have put all of this together and compiled this into a proper chronicle. The latest entry is from 1154. The chronicle ends with the death of King Stephen. This chronicle, as soon as it was compiled and a periodic addition to it, it is said that it was distributed to the monasteries across England. As we mentioned before, monasteries had a very important role to play in the Anglo-Saxon times in the cultural and religious life of England. And the fragments of these original manuscripts the copies of these manuscripts are now available in the British Library. It's also a kind of an interest for many historians and linguists. And it's said that about 7 or 9 manuscripts from those times are available now, but none of them are original. The original was perhaps lost in fire or due to some other natural calamity. And it's generally said that the original manuscript which compiled all of these events, it was created by King Alfred during his time. This also shows his passion for not just art and literature, but also a passion for a sense of history to be compiled, and the need for documentation which would make things easier for the posterity. So in that sense, King Alfred was a very important intervening figure in the history of the Anglo-Saxon period. And it's in this work that we also find about the story of Kinniwulf and Kinniherd, perhaps another poet. So there's also a lot of historical evidence for the existence of poets such as Kinniwulf. And this document becomes important in ensuring a kind of continuity into the Middle English period, because we find that in certain ways the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it pans over a vast amount of time from BC 60 till about 1154. In that sense, there is a way in which we have a document which enables us to seamlessly enter the Middle English period and also identify certain continuities which are present not just in prose but also in the cultural and religious life of England. As we begin to wind up this lecture, it's very important to highlight the role of church and Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. You may have noted right from the beginning of the discussion that church and religion is at the center of almost all the discussions. So it's very difficult to even begin to talk about the story of England without talking about the history of church, the history of monasteries and the religious life from the Anglo-Saxon or even from the Celtic period onwards. David Daitches has got this thing to say about the role of Christianity. With the triumph of Christianity, all culture was ecclesiastical culture, and ecclesiastical culture was based on Latin. This is perhaps the best way in which one can summarize the Old English period. And the story, as we know, begins with the conversion of England to Christianity in 597 AD. And we also know that soon after that there is a significant development of ecclesiastical institutions, particularly monasteries, which continue to serve as a center of learning, a center of culture, a center of dissemination of knowledge, so on and so forth. Also later on we will begin to note that the church even serves as a center of performance, and in that sense the earliest drama also gets enacted in churches. And also the role of the clerics in carrying on the cultural tradition of the period is also quite noteworthy, and so much so that David Daitches sums up like this: the man of culture belonged first of all to church, and the impressive claims of secular literature had not yet begun to be asserted. In the following sections, we will also begin to see how in the Middle English period there is a gradual transition from the religious literature towards the secular literature. And also, as Daitches points out in one of his introductions about the man of culture belonging to church, we find that the same church becomes a stifling element in terms of art and literature at a later point of time. So all of these transition, the cultural transition, the religious transition and the literary transitions are quite important when we begin to map the journey of literature across ages. So with this, we begin to wind up today's lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to see you in the next class.